The boy stood just inside the towering glass doors of the boardroom, his heart pounding so loudly it felt like everyone could hear it. The room was enormous, cold, and impossibly clean, with a long polished table stretching beneath crystal lights that reflected generations of wealth and power. Every person seated there wore confidence like a tailored suit, sharp eyes, calm posture, voices accustomed to being obeyed. In the center sat the billionaire, Richard Hallstrom, relaxed in his chair, fingers loosely intertwined, his presence commanding the space without effort. To him, this meeting was routine, numbers, votes, control. The boy, however, felt like he had stepped into another world, one his mother had described only in whispers. His clothes were simple, carefully cleaned the night before, his shoes scuffed from years of walking instead of riding. He took a step forward, swallowing the fear clawing at his throat, and felt every gaze turned toward him with mild irritation. Someone sighed. Another glanced at their watch. No one expected anything important from a boy who looked like he had wandered in by mistake. Gathering strength from memories of his mother's trembling hands and tired smile, he spoke clearly, forcing his voice not to shake. I came to claim my inheritance. For a split second, the air froze. Then laughter rolled through the room like a careless wave. Not cruel laughter at first, but the amused disbelief of people who had never been challenged. A man near the end of the table smirked openly. A woman covered her smile with her hand. Richard leaned back, lips curling in a relaxed grin, entertained. "This isn't a charity office," he said lightly. "Do you know where you are, son?" The boy nodded, his eyes steady despite the humiliation burning his face. "Yes," he replied. That only made the laughter sharper. Someone whispered about calling security. Someone else joked about social experiments. Richard raised a hand, silencing them, curiosity flickering behind his confidence. "Let him finish," he said, voice smooth. "I'd like to hear this." The boy took another breath, his fingers curling into his palms. "My name is Daniel," he said. "My mother was Elena Rivera." The name moved through the room differently than his words before. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Richard's smile stiffened for just a heartbeat. He straightened slightly, eyes narrowing. "That's not possible," he said, tone cooling. "Elena left a long time ago." Daniel's chest tightened, but he continued. "She told me you would say that." Murmurs spread. The lawyer at the table leaned forward, interest replacing boredom. Richard's voice hardened. "This meeting is over." Daniel didn't move. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his worn backpack and pulled out an envelope, so old it looked fragile. "She told me," he said softly, "that if you denied me, I should give this to the board." The room went silent, not out of respect, but curiosity. The lawyer gestured. "Bring it here." Daniel walked forward, every step echoing too loudly in his ears, and placed the envelope into the lawyer's hands. As it was opened, something shifted, an unease no one wanted to name. Pages were read. The lawyer's expression changed, then changed again. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the documents. "These are notarized," he said quietly, "and legally valid." A low murmur filled the room. Richard stood abruptly. "What are you saying?" The lawyer met his eyes. "This is a trust agreement you signed over 20 years ago. It states that any child born to Elena Rivera would be entitled to a controlling share of inheritance." The laughter from earlier felt suddenly shameful, echoing in Daniel's mind like a wound reopening. Richard's face drained of color. "That's impossible," he snapped. "I never." He stopped himself, the memory crashing back with brutal clarity. The room waited. Daniel stood still, his legs weak, his mother's voice ringing in his ears. "Don't be afraid of the truth." For the first time since he had entered, no one looked at him with amusement. They looked at him with disbelief, fear, and dawning realization. The billionaire who had laughed moments ago now stared at the boy, as if seeing a ghost from a past he had buried. And in that silence, Daniel realized something powerful. He was no longer invisible. The silence that followed the lawyer's words felt heavier than any shout could have been, pressing down on every person seated around the table. Daniel remained standing, unsure whether to sit or stay where he was, his body tense as if the floor beneath him might vanish at any moment. Across from him, Richard Hallstrom slowly lowered himself back into his chair, the confidence that once wrapped around him now cracked and uneven. He stared at the documents spread across the table as though they were a mirror reflecting a version of himself he had tried to erase. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their polished composure beginning to fracture. This was no longer an inconvenience. It was a threat to order, control, and carefully protected legacies. The company's chief legal officer cleared his throat, breaking the silence with professional restraint. He explained that the trust agreement had been created during a turbulent period in Richard's life, a time when legal protections were drafted quickly and quietly. It was designed as a safeguard, he said, to ensure responsibility if circumstances changed. Richard clenched his jaw, the word responsibility cutting deeper than any accusation. He looked up at Daniel again, studying him more closely now. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn tilt of the chin. Recognition stirred uneasily in his chest. "Where did you grow up?" he asked abruptly. Daniel hesitated, then answered honestly. "Wherever rent was cheapest," he said. "My mother worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. A murmur of discomfort passed through the room. One board member shifted in her seat. Another frowned, clearly wishing this conversation were happening anywhere else. Richard's voice lowered. "Why didn't she come back?" Daniel swallowed. "She tried. She wrote letters. She called. She stopped when it became clear you didn't want to hear from her." The words landed without accusation, but they stung more than anger ever could. Richard looked away, his reflection staring back at him from the glass wall overlooking the city. He had built an empire so tall it blocked out the past, or so he thought. The lawyer interrupted gently, reminding the board that emotional discussion did not change legal obligations. "We must verify everything," he said. "DNA testing, document authentication. Until then, we proceed cautiously." The chairwoman nodded. "Arrange it immediately." A staff member approached Daniel with a clipboard, explaining the procedure in a voice that tried, and failed, to sound neutral. As samples were taken, Daniel felt strangely detached, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold. He remembered his mother's hands shaking as she told him the truth, the fear in her eyes that he might be rejected, humiliated. "You don't owe him anything," she had said, "but you deserve to be acknowledged." Around the table, the board began whispering in urgent tones, calculating consequences, stock prices, public perception, power shifts. Daniel heard fragments: control, shares, media fallout. No one asked how he felt. Richard stood again, pacing slowly behind his chair, his hands clenched. "If this is true," he said, voice tight, "everything changes." One board member responded sharply. "It already has." The tension escalated as the possibility settled in. This poor boy could alter decades of carefully structured authority. Richard stopped pacing and faced Daniel fully. "Did she tell you why she left?" he asked. Daniel met his gaze. "She said she loved you," he replied. "But she wouldn't disappear for someone who treated her like an inconvenience." The room felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening. Richard closed his eyes briefly, memories rushing back. Arguments, ambition, a choice he had justified too easily. When he opened them, his voice was quieter. "You shouldn't have grown up like that." Daniel shrugged. "I didn't know anything else." Hours passed in a blur of calls and paperwork. The board suspended all other business. When the lawyer finally returned with preliminary verification, his expression was grim. "The documents are authentic," he said. "There's no question about that." A collective breath was held. "We're only waiting on DNA confirmation." Richard sank into his chair, the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. Daniel sat across from him now, exhaustion replacing fear. For the first time, they existed in the same space not as strangers, but as two people bound by truth neither could escape. And as the room filled with quiet tension, one thing became clear: no amount of wealth could buy back the years already lost. The celebration inside the factory slowly faded into stunned silence as reality settled in. The machine continued to run flawlessly, its steady rhythm echoing like a heartbeat restored after near death. Engineers stood around the boy with a mix of awe and confusion, whispering to one another, replaying every step he had taken. The owner, however, felt disconnected from the noise around him. His eyes remained fixed on the child's face, on the curve of his brow, the shape of his eyes, the way he frowned slightly when concentrating. Each detail stirred something deep and painful. He had seen this face before, not here, not like this, but in memories he had locked away long ago. He asked the boy again about his name, this time softer, almost afraid of the answer. When the child repeated it, the sound seemed to echo inside the man's chest. His breath caught, and for a brief moment, the powerful businessman looked like a man about to fall apart. The boy stood quietly, unsure of what to do now that the impossible had been done. Applause made him uncomfortable. Attention always had. He glanced down at his dirty clothes, suddenly feeling out of place in the clean, bright factory. One of the engineers offered him water. Another placed a towel on his shoulders, gestures filled with gratitude but also curiosity. The owner watched all of it, his mind racing backward through time. 12 years ago, there had been arguments, bitterness, a painful divorce that shattered his family. His wife had left suddenly, pregnant, refusing to stay in a world where ambition mattered more than people. Lawyers, anger, and pride had done the rest. Later, he had heard rumors that she struggled, that she disappeared from the city. He had searched briefly, then stopped, convincing himself it was better not to reopen old wounds. Now, standing in front of him, was a child the exact age his son would have been. He asked the boy where his parents were. The question was gentle, but it made the child stiffen. He answered honestly, saying his mother had died a few years ago after a long illness. They had moved often, he said, always chasing work, always struggling. After her death, there had been no one. He survived by polishing shoes, sleeping wherever he could. The words hit the owner harder than any financial loss ever had. Around them, the engineers slowly backed away, sensing something deeply personal unfolding. The factory felt too big, too loud for a conversation that suddenly required silence. The owner led the boy to his office, closing the glass door behind them. The city skyline stretched outside, bright and distant, unaware that a different kind of reckoning was happening inside. The owner sat down heavily, rubbing his face as if trying to wake from a dream. He asked the boy about the machines again, about where he learned to think the way he did. The child shrugged, explaining that his mother used to tell him stories about his father, a man who loved machines and believed they could change the world. She had taught him basics from old books, broken devices they fixed together, nights spent imagining a better future. As the boy spoke, tears welled up in the owner's eyes. Those were his books, his words, his dreams, passed unknowingly to a son he had never held. The room felt smaller with every sentence, the weight of regret pressing down on him. Unable to ignore it any longer, the owner ordered a DNA test, his voice shaking as he spoke to his assistant. The boy didn't fully understand what was happening, only that something important was being decided. Hours passed in unbearable tension. Outside, news of the machine's revival spread like wildfire, investors celebrating, media praising the miracle turnaround. Inside the office, time crawled. When the report finally arrived, the owner's hands trembled so violently he could barely open it. One glance was enough. The words blurred as tears streamed down his face. There was no doubt. The boy was his son that he fell to his knees in front of the child, pride and power dissolving into raw emotion. He apologized over and over, words breaking apart under the weight of years lost. The boy stood frozen, shock flooding his small body as the truth crashed into him. This man, the one everyone feared, admired, obeyed, was his father. The same father his mother had spoken about in whispers, with sadness and hope mixed together. Confusion, anger, longing, and disbelief tangled inside him. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. The factory outside continued to roar with success, but inside that quiet office, something far more important was being rebuilt. A broken bond, a stolen childhood, and a future neither of them had ever imagined would begin with a shoe polish box and a silent machine. Days after the revelation, the tension that had gripped the boardroom seemed to follow Daniel everywhere he went within the towering glass walls of the Hallstrom Corporation. Though legally recognized as an heir, he still felt like an outsider stepping into a world that had been carefully constructed without him. The corridors smelled of polished wood and ambition, and the echo of his footsteps reminded him that every move here carried weight, though he had nothing yet to weigh. Richard Hallstrom, once untouchable in his confidence, now navigated these same hallways with a subtle wariness, aware that a part of his life he had tried to ignore now had a voice. Daniel was invited to attend a series of briefings with the board, ostensibly to familiarize himself with the company's operations. But he quickly realized they were testing him, gauging his reactions, trying to measure the threat he represented. Each meeting felt like a trial. Analysts spoke in precise numbers and charts, demonstrating profits, losses, and strategic decisions. Daniel listened attentively, taking notes with a pen that had seen better days, yet absorbing more than anyone expected. Occasionally, he would glance at Richard, who observed him silently, his face a mixture of pride, regret, and the faint tremor of vulnerability. Daniel's presence, so ordinary against the backdrop of luxury, began to unsettle more than a few board members. Whispers followed him, conjectures about how this young man, who had grown up counting coins and walking miles, might influence the company's future. A few viewed him with disdain, a few with curiosity, and some with fear. Yet Daniel refused to mirror the arrogance or cynicism he encountered. Instead, he carried himself with quiet dignity, shaped by hardship, resilience, and the memory of his mother's guidance. One afternoon, he entered a large conference room for a meeting with the executives. Charts lit up the screens behind them, and financial data scrolled like streams of numbers that most people would find indecipherable. Daniel asked questions, sometimes pointed, sometimes naive, but each question forced seasoned executives to pause, reconsider, and, in some cases, admit they had overlooked a detail. Richard watched him from across the table, a mixture of pride and unease tightening his chest. Here was his son, not yet fully recognized by the world, yet already making waves simply by refusing to be ignored. When the meeting adjourned, Daniel lingered to ask about company policies that seemed to favor long-established practices over innovative thinking. His questions were met with a mixture of frustration and begrudging admiration. Richard finally approached him, speaking quietly, away from the scrutiny of the other executives. "You're not like I expected," he admitted, his voice low, almost hesitant. Daniel looked up, meeting his father's gaze. "I don't want to be," he said. "I want to understand, to learn, and to make sure nothing like my childhood happens to anyone else here or outside these walls." Richard felt a lump in his throat. For the first time, he recognized that wealth without compassion, power without empathy, meant nothing. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel began to carve a place for himself, not through entitlement, but through observation, thought, and careful interaction. He asked about employee welfare, community projects, and long-term sustainability. Each question subtly shifted the board's conversation, forcing seasoned members to reconsider priorities they had long ignored. Richard watched silently, learning from his son as much as teaching him, and realizing that the inheritance Daniel had claimed was not merely financial. It was a legacy of responsibility he had neglected. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Richard invited Daniel to his private office. The city lights shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the room in golds and blues. "You're changing things already," Richard said, voice quieter than usual. "And not everyone likes it." Daniel nodded. "I didn't come here to please them," he replied. "I came here to be acknowledged and to ensure fairness, not just for me, but for everyone affected by this company." Richard exhaled, a mix of relief and apprehension. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly. Daniel's throat tightened. "I hope she would have been," he said. In the following weeks, Daniel began participating in board votes, often silently at first, observing patterns and relationships. His presence became a reminder of the past, a living testament to choices made and ignored. Executives who once laughed or dismissed him now approached with caution and, in some cases, respect. Daniel discovered the power of quiet influence, asking questions that provoked thought, listening more than speaking, and letting results speak for themselves. Richard often caught himself watching his son, marveling at his resilience and integrity, and recognizing that he had not prepared him for wealth, but had prepared him for life. And for Daniel, each step into the Hallstrom Corporation's world was both an awakening and a reckoning. He felt the weight of his inheritance not as money or status, but as a responsibility to honor the truth, his mother's memory, and the fragile, complex ties that bound him to a father who had once laughed at him. Slowly, imperceptibly, the room that had seemed so cold and unyielding began to change, not because the board had approved it, but because Daniel's presence demanded it. The laughter, the arrogance, and the dismissiveness were replaced by a quiet awareness that wealth and power meant nothing without conscience, and that even a boy from humble beginnings could shift the balance of a world built on pride. By the time the week ended, Daniel walked the corridors with confidence, not arrogance, but a calm assurance rooted in the knowledge that he had finally claimed something far greater than any inheritance: acknowledgement, respect, and the beginning of true connection with the father who had once been a stranger.